You're not trapped by anger, you're trapped by how you hold on. The art of letting go reveals how to release and reclaim your peace. The Art of Letting Go. Introduction. The familiar heat rises in your chest, your jaw clenches, and time seems to slow as words escape your mouth. Words you know you'll regret, yet feel powerless to stop. In that moment, logic and reason evaporate like morning dew, replaced by a primal surge that demands expression. Later, in the quiet aftermath, you'll wonder how it happened again, despite your best intentions and countless promises to do better next time. You've tried everything, counting to 10, deep breathing, walking away, even punching pillows. Sometimes these techniques work, but more often, they feel like bringing a water pistol to a forest fire. The anger still smolders beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark to ignite it. Meanwhile, the cost of these emotional explosions continues to mount. Strained relationships, professional setbacks, and the crushing weight of regret that follows each outburst. If you're like most people, you've come to see anger as an enemy to be conquered, a dragon to be slain. But what if this very perspective is what keeps you trapped in an endless cycle of resistance and release? What if your anger isn't actually the problem, but rather your relationship with it? Here's a truth that might surprise you. Anger itself isn't the enemy. It's actually a messenger trying to communicate something vital about your values, boundaries, and needs. The real problem lies not in feeling anger, but in how we've been taught to grip it tightly, as though it were a weapon of protection or a shield against future harm. This book won't offer you another set of techniques to manage your anger. Instead, it presents something far more powerful, a fundamental shift in understanding that makes such techniques largely unnecessary. You'll discover that freedom from anger doesn't come from adding new skills to your arsenal, but from recognizing and releasing what you've been unknowingly carrying all along. Imagine standing at the edge of a rushing river, your arms laden with heavy stones. These stones represent your accumulated grievances, resentments, and perceived injustices. Your muscles ache from their weight, yet you hold on, convinced these stones are somehow protecting you, defining you, or securing your right to justice. But what if these very stones are actually anchoring you to your suffering? What if the path to freedom lies not in gripping tighter, but in the gentle art of opening your hands? This journey won't promise overnight transformation or a life completely free from anger. Such promises would be dishonest. What it offers instead is a new way of seeing that naturally dissolves anger's power over time, allowing you to respond to life's challenges with increasing clarity and ease. As you turn these pages, you'll discover that the prison of anger has always had an unlocked door. You simply haven't recognized it until now. Chapter 1. The Messenger You've Been Shooting. Through centuries of human civilization, a timeless tale has been passed down. The story of a proud king who grew weary of receiving troubling news from his messengers. In his desire for peace of mind, he began executing any messenger who brought unfavorable reports. Soon, no one dared deliver anything but pleasant news. The kingdom's enemies gathered at the borders, crops failed in distant provinces, and corruption spread through the courts, all while the king remained blissfully unaware in his palace, surrounded only by smiling faces and agreeable words. When his kingdom finally fell, he discovered too late that his real enemy hadn't been the messengers, but his refusal to hear their vital warnings. You've likely been taught to treat anger as that king treated his messengers, as an unwelcome intruder, to be eliminated, controlled, or suppressed. Modern society reinforces this view, offering countless techniques to manage anger, as though it were a wild beast to be tamed. These approaches might bring temporary relief, but they often leave you feeling like you're in an endless battle with your own emotions. What if, like those messengers in the ancient tale, anger isn't your enemy at all? What if it's actually trying to deliver critical information about your life, your boundaries, and your deepest values? This perspective shift begins with understanding anger's evolutionary purpose. Our ancestors didn't survive by calmly analyzing every threat. They needed rapid signals that could instantly prepare them for fight or flight. Anger served as that signal, flooding the body with energy and sharpening focus when boundaries were violated or resources threatened. This system still operates in your brain today, though the threats you face are more often social than physical. Think of the last time you felt angry. Perhaps someone dismissed your ideas in a meeting, a friend betrayed your trust, or a stranger cut you off in traffic. In each case, anger arose as a messenger carrying vital information. Your contributions deserve respect. Trust is essential in friendship. Physical safety matters. The problem wasn't the message itself. These are valid concerns reflecting important values. The suffering came from how you responded to the messenger. Many of us have developed habit patterns around anger that mirror that foolish king. We either attack the messenger through suppression, I shouldn't feel this way, let it take over the kingdom through uncontrolled expression, or try to lock it away through denial. Meanwhile, the real message, the underlying information about our needs, boundaries, or values, goes unheard. This is where emotional intelligence regarding anger becomes crucial. It's the ability to receive anger's message without being consumed by its energy. Like learning to read a letter without setting it on fire or getting paper cuts, you can extract anger's valuable information without letting it burn you or others. You might be thinking, but some things deserve anger. There's real injustice in the world. You're absolutely right. Anger often arises in response to genuine wrongs or violations. But even here, there's a crucial distinction between hearing anger's message about injustice and letting anger dictate your response. The most effective agents of social change have typically been those who could channel anger's energy into focused action while maintaining clarity and strategic thinking. Instead of attacking anger or surrendering to it, try interviewing it. When anger appears, pause, like creating space to read a message rather than immediately reacting to it. Get curious about what information it's trying to deliver. What boundary has been crossed? What value feels threatened? What need isn't being met? Separate the signal, the important message about your values, from the noise, the urge to lash out or shut down. The next time you feel anger rising, ask yourself, if this anger could speak clearly, what would it tell me about what matters most to me? What is it trying to protect or preserve? These questions transform anger from an enemy into an informant, offering valuable intelligence about your inner world. You're not interrogating the anger to dismiss it, but rather to understand the deeper truth it carries about your values and boundaries. When you approach your emotions with this kind of curiosity rather than judgment, something remarkable happens. The intensity often begins to shift. The burning urgency that demands immediate action softens into a clearer signal that invites thoughtful response. Your anger becomes less of a reactive force hijacking your behavior and more of a spotlight illuminating what you truly care about in this situation. This simple shift in perspective doesn't diminish your power, it actually enhances it by putting you back in the driver's seat of your emotional experience. Chapter 2. The Invisible Chains. Imagine being in a swimming pool, determined to reach the other side. You push hard against the water, your muscles straining with effort. But something keeps pulling you back. No matter how powerfully you swim, you barely make progress. Eventually, exhausted and frustrated, you discover the truth. There's an anchor chained to your ankle, hidden beneath the surface. All this time, you've been fighting not just the water, but an invisible force dragging you down. This is how expectations operate in your life, particularly in relation to anger. Like that hidden anchor, your expectations about how life should be, how others should behave, how you should feel, create constant resistance against reality. The harder you swim against this resistance, the more exhausted and angry you become. You've likely experienced this countless times. A coworker should have completed their part of the project by now. Your partner should know what you need without you having to explain it. Traffic should move faster. You should be further along in your career. The world should be fair. Notice how each should creates a gap between reality and your mental model of how things ought to be. This gap is where anger thrives. Consider two people stuck in the same traffic jam. The first driver left home expecting clear roads and a quick commute. Each passing minute fills them with increasing rage. This shouldn't be happening. The second driver anticipated potential delays and left early. Same situation, radically different emotional experience. The traffic hasn't changed, only the expectations differed. Your mind constantly generates these expectations, often without your awareness. They form an invisible web of demands that reality must satisfy. People must respect your time. Your efforts must be appreciated. Your plans must work out. Life must be fair. Each must becomes a potential trigger for anger when reality inevitably fails to comply. This isn't about having no standards or accepting mistreatment. Rather, it's about recognizing the difference between healthy preferences and rigid demands. I would like my coworker to be punctual, create space for reality to be different from your preference. My coworker must be punctual sets you up for anger when they're late. The subtlety of expectations makes them particularly challenging to identify. They often disguise themselves as reasonable standards or important values. Of course, you want people to be honest, reliable, and considerate. Of course, you want your efforts to bear fruit. These aren't wrong desires. The problem arises when these preferences harden into demands, when "I would like" transforms into "it must be this way." Pay attention to your language, both internal and external. Words like should, must, have to, and supposed to often signal hidden expectations. Each one represents a potential anchor weighing you down, creating resistance against what is. When you catch yourself using these words, pause. What expectation are you holding? How might this rigid demand be contributing to your anger? Take that traffic scenario again. You might feel justified in your expectation of flowing traffic. After all, you paid your taxes. The roads should be maintained, and traffic should be managed efficiently. But notice how each should adds weight to your anchor, increasing your resistance to what's actually happening. The traffic isn't moving any faster because of your expectations. The only thing changing is your level of suffering. The work isn't about eliminating all expectations. That's neither possible nor desirable. Instead, it's about holding them more lightly. Can you transform rigid demands into flexible preferences? Can you maintain your values and standards while creating space for reality to be different from your mental model? This shift from expectation to preference might seem subtle, but its impact on your anger is profound. When you release the anchor of should, you're free to respond to life as it is, rather than constantly fighting how it ought to be. You begin to navigate reality with more flexibility and less friction. The energy once spent resisting what is happening now becomes available for creative problem-solving and genuine enjoyment. Your mind quiets as you stop arguing with reality, and in that quietness, you discover a resilience that was always there, waiting for you to let go of your rigid demands on life. The world doesn't suddenly conform to your wishes. It never did and never will. But you find yourself surprisingly at peace with that truth. Chapter 3. The Stories We Tell. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit theater, watching the same distressing scene play over and over. The lights never come up, the credits never roll, and somehow you're both the captive audience and the unwitting projectionist. This is how your mind works with anger, continuously replaying and reconstructing events that trigger you, adding layers of meaning and emotion with each showing. When someone cuts you off in traffic, the physical event lasts mere seconds, yet your mind might replay this scene for hours or even days, adding dramatic narratives. That inconsiderate jerk could have killed me. Nobody respects anyone anymore. The world is full of selfish people. What began as a simple swerve of a car transforms into an epic tale of moral decay and personal victimization. Or consider receiving a brief, curt email from your boss. The actual event is just black text on a white screen, but your mind spins an elaborate story. She's obviously unhappy with my work. I'm probably going to get passed over for the promotion. She's always had it out for me. A 3-sentence email becomes a full-length feature film about workplace injustice and career catastrophe. These stories seem to arise automatically, and in many ways, they do. Humans are naturally meaning-making creatures. It's how we make sense of our world. But there's a crucial difference between what actually happened and the story you tell about what happened. The first is objective reality. The second is your mind's interpretation, judgment, and elaboration. Think about a recent situation that made you angry. Now strip away every interpretation, judgment, and assumption until only the bare observable facts remain. Instead of, my friend disrespected me by showing up late again because they don't value my time, you're left with, person A arrived at location B at time C. Notice how differently you feel when you hold just the facts versus the full narrative. This isn't to suggest that your interpretations are necessarily wrong. Sometimes your stories might be entirely plausible. Maybe that driver was being reckless. Perhaps your boss is unhappy with your work. But even plausible stories are still stories, mental constructions that you have the power to hold differently. These narrative loops become self-perpetuating cycles. Each time you replay the mental movie, you add new details, insights, and emotional resonance. The story grows more elaborate, more convincing, and more triggering. You become increasingly invested in its truth, making it harder to consider alternative interpretations or simply let it go. When someone at work takes credit for your idea, the initial sting of frustration can be transformed through storytelling into an ongoing source of rage. Your mind might generate scenes from the past. They've always been opportunistic. Project into the future. They'll keep doing this unless I stop them. And create meaning. This proves I can't trust anyone here. Each layer of narrative reinforces and amplifies the anger, keeping it alive long after the meeting ended. The power of these stories lies in their invisibility. Like water to a fish, they're so much a part of your mental environment that you don't recognize them as stories at all. They simply feel like reality itself. This is why two people can experience the same event so differently. Each person's unique narrative filter transforms raw experience into personal meaning, creating vastly different emotional responses to identical situations. The key insight isn't about eliminating stories. That's neither possible nor desirable. Rather, it's about developing the awareness to recognize your stories as stories. When you can separate the objective events from your interpretations of them, you gain the freedom to hold those interpretations more lightly. In this space of awareness, you discover that your narrative isn't carved in stone, but painted in watercolors, fluid, changeable, and open to revision. You might still choose to believe your initial interpretation, but now it's a conscious choice rather than an automatic reaction. This subtle shift transforms you from a passive recipient of your stories into their mindful curator, free to question, modify, or release them as you see fit. Try this. The next time you feel anger arising, pause and ask yourself, what actually happened? Observable facts. Versus, what story am I telling about what happened? Interpretations, judgments, meanings. Write these down in parallel columns. This simple practice can create enough space between event and interpretation to loosen anger's grip. This separation doesn't invalidate your feelings or suggest you shouldn't care about what happens. Instead, it offers the freedom to respond to life's challenges without being trapped in recurring narratives that generate fresh anger with each mental showing. As you develop this awareness, you'll find yourself able to be present with what is, rather than lost in stories about what it all means. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Control. Picture someone standing on a beach during a storm, screaming at the wind to change direction, hands raised in futile command, becoming increasingly frustrated as the gale continues its natural course. You've likely experienced this same exhausting dynamic in your own life. Not with actual weather, but with people and circumstances you desperately wish you could control. Your spouse keeps leaving dishes in the sink despite countless discussions. Your teenager continues making choices you believe will harm their future. Your coworker persists in habits that make your job more difficult. Your family members maintain political views you find deeply problematic. In each situation, you feel the mounting pressure of knowing exactly how things should be, coupled with the maddening inability to make them that way. This desire for control isn't a character flaw. It's a natural response to the uncertainty and unpredictability of life. Your mind seeks safety through predictability, and when people or situations threaten that safety by deviating from your preferred script, anger arises as a tool to attempt to restore order. However, this presents an unsolvable equation. The scope of what matters to you, your circle of concern, vastly exceeds the scope of what you can actually influence. You care about your family members' health choices, your neighbor's parking habits, your coworker's work ethic, societal attitudes, political decisions, and countless other factors that affect your life. But caring about something doesn't grant you the power to control it. In workplace scenarios, you might invest enormous emotional energy trying to change a colleague's communication style or work habits. In relationships, you might repeatedly attempt to modify your partner's behavior or emotional responses. In family dynamics, you might struggle endlessly to shift relatives' perspectives or choices. Each attempt at control seems logical in the moment. If only they would change, your frustration would end. But notice the paradox. The more energy you expend trying to control what you cannot, the less energy remains for influencing what you can. When you're focused on making your partner be more emotionally expressive, you miss opportunities to improve your own communication. While fixating on changing your colleague's work style, you overlook ways to adapt your approach. In trying to force your teenager to make different choices, you lose chances to strengthen your relationship and model better decision-making. Consider your current triggers for anger. For each situation, ask yourself, what aspects of this can I actually control? You'll likely discover that your influence is far more limited than your concern. You can control your own actions, responses, and choices, but you cannot control others' thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. This isn't about passivity or resignation. Rather, it's about directing your energy where it can actually create change. When you accept the limits of your control, you paradoxically increase your effectiveness within your sphere of influence. Instead of exhausting yourself trying to change the wind, you learn to adjust your sails. Take the common scenario of traffic. You cannot control other drivers' behavior, road construction, or weather conditions, but you can control your departure time, route selection, and most importantly, your response to delays and obstacles. The moment you truly accept what lies beyond your control, you free up energy to master what lies within it. The same principle applies to interpersonal conflicts. You cannot control whether someone respects your boundaries, but you can consistently maintain them. You cannot force someone to value your time, but you can choose how you allocate it. You cannot make someone see your perspective, but you can communicate it clearly and choose your response when they don't. A useful practice is to mentally place in a box everything in a triggering situation that lies beyond your control. This isn't about ignoring these elements, but about acknowledging the futility of trying to directly change them. What remains outside the box becomes an exercise in acceptance. What remains inside becomes your focus for action. This shift from attempting to control external reality to mastering your internal response represents true power. It's the difference between being the person screaming at the wind and the skilled sailor who uses the wind's power by working with it rather than against it. When you release the exhausting struggle to bend circumstances to your will, you discover a deeper strength, the ability to shape your experience through conscious choice rather than reactive resistance. Your energy transforms from a scattered force spent fighting what is into a focused power that flows with life's currents, while maintaining your chosen direction. This is not surrender, but strategic wisdom that recognizes where your true influence lies. Chapter 5. The Identity Trap. Imagine constructing your sense of self atop quicksand. Every attempt to establish solid footing only pulls you deeper into instability. This is what happens when anger becomes intertwined with identity. When "I am angry" transforms from a temporary experience into a core definition of who you believe yourself to be. You might recognize this pattern in thoughts like, "I've always had a short temper," or "I'm just a passionate person. It's who I am." These aren't merely neutral observations. They're self-fulfilling prophecies that shape how you interpret and respond to every trigger in your life. When anger becomes your baseline, your expected response, it stops being something that happens to you and becomes something that defines you. This identity fusion often begins subtly. Perhaps you grew up in an environment where anger was the primary emotional currency, where raised voices and heated responses were the norm. Or maybe anger became your protective shield, the way you learned to establish boundaries or command respect. Over time, these patterns crystallized into fundamental beliefs about who you are. The challenge lies in how identity shapes perception and behavior. When you see yourself as quick-tempered, you unconsciously seek evidence that confirms this self-image. Minor irritations become proof of your natural tendencies. Moments of calm get dismissed as exceptions rather than possibilities. This self-reinforcing cycle makes anger feel inevitable rather than optional. Consider how differently you might respond to triggers if you saw yourself as naturally calm or inherently peaceful. The same situation that currently sparks immediate rage might instead evoke curiosity or compassion. This isn't about denying anger when it arises, but about questioning whether it must be your default response. Your anger may have served important functions in your life. It might have protected you in vulnerable situations, helped you stand up against injustice, or given you the strength to face challenging circumstances. Acknowledging these benefits doesn't mean you must continue defining yourself through anger. Just as a child outgrows training wheels without dismissing their past usefulness, you can honor anger's role in your journey while choosing different ways to meet those same needs. The key insight is that you are not your anger. You are the awareness that experiences anger. This distinction creates space between your essential self and the emotional states that flow through you. Like weather patterns across an unchanging sky, anger can arise and pass without altering who you fundamentally are. Examine how anger might be serving your identity needs. Does it make you feel strong, righteous, protected? Understanding these underlying functions allows you to explore alternative ways to meet these same needs. Strength can come from calm certainty rather than explosive force. Protection can arise from clear boundaries rather than defensive hostility. Righteousness can express itself through composed action rather than angry reaction. Start noticing the self-definitions you hold around anger. When you catch yourself thinking, "That's just how I am," or "I can't help it," pause to question these assumptions. Each moment offers a fresh choice. Your past patterns don't have to dictate your future responses. This isn't about forcefully reconstructing your identity or denying your experiences. Rather, it's about gently expanding your self-concept to include more possibilities. You're not erasing who you've been. You're creating space for who you might become. Think of it as opening a window in a room where anger's heat has long been trapped. You're not demolishing the room. You're allowing fresh air to circulate, creating new possibilities for temperature regulation. Your identity can expand to include both the capacity for anger and the capacity for peace, with conscious choice rather than habitual reaction, determining which manifests in any given moment. As you loosen anger's grip on your identity, you may notice its ripple effects throughout your life, how it has influenced your relationships, career choices, and daily interactions. Understanding these impacts will be crucial as you continue this journey of transformation. You'll start seeing patterns in how anger has shaped your decisions, perhaps driving you away from opportunities or causing you to build walls where bridges could have stood. In moments of reflection, you might recognize how its presence has colored countless small moments. The tone of voice you've used with loved ones, the assumptions you've made about others' intentions, the energy you've spent defending against imagined slights. This awareness isn't meant to burden you with regret, but to illuminate the profound possibilities that await as you create space for new ways of being. Chapter 6. The Ripple Effect. Picture a stone dropping into a still pond. The initial splash may seem localized, but the ripples extend outward in ever-widening circles, touching every part of the water's surface. Your anger operates in much the same way. While you might focus only on the immediate trigger and reaction, its effects radiate outward, touching every aspect of your life in ways you may not fully recognize. In those heated moments when anger takes hold, your awareness typically narrows to the immediate situation, the person who wronged you, the circumstance that feels unfair, the boundary that's been crossed. This tunnel vision makes it difficult to see how your anger reverberates through your entire existence, creating patterns that shape your health, relationships, decisions, and overall quality of life. Research in health psychology reveals the profound physical toll of chronic anger. Each burst of rage triggers a cascade of stress hormones that tax your cardiovascular system, suppress your immune function, and create patterns of muscular tension. Over time, these physiological responses can contribute to hypertension, increased risk of heart disease, and accelerated cellular aging. Your body bears the burden of every angry moment, even those you think you've moved past. The impact on your relationships may be even more significant. When anger becomes a frequent visitor in your interactions, it erodes the foundation of trust and emotional safety that healthy connections require. Your heightened reactivity reduces your capacity for empathy, making it harder to see situations from others' perspectives or respond with understanding rather than judgment. Those closest to you begin walking on eggshells, carefully monitoring their words and actions to avoid triggering your responses. This dynamic creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Their cautious behavior may feel patronizing or inauthentic, generating fresh triggers for your anger. Your cognitive function also suffers under anger's influence. Studies in neuroscience demonstrate how anger narrows your attention, limiting your ability to process information and consider alternative perspectives. Your decision-making becomes impaired as the emotional centers of your brain override areas responsible for rational analysis. Problems that might have creative solutions appear to have only two options: fight or surrender. This restricted thinking perpetuates cycles of reactivity and limits your ability to navigate complex situations effectively. Consider how your anger might be affecting your professional life. Even if you maintain tight control over your emotional expression at work, the internal experience of anger consumes mental and emotional resources that could be directed toward more productive ends. Your colleagues likely sense your underlying tension, which can impact team dynamics and limit opportunities for collaboration or advancement. The cumulative effect of these impacts creates what we might call anger's shadow, a persistent darkening of your life experience that extends far beyond the moments of active anger. This shadow manifests in subtle ways: the opportunities you miss because people find you difficult to work with, the relationships that never deepen because others keep their distance, the creative solutions you can't see because your mind is clouded by resentment. You might argue that your anger serves important functions, motivating you to take action, establishing boundaries, or addressing injustice. While these benefits may appear valid in the short term, they come at a tremendous cost. Every instance of using anger as a tool reinforces neural pathways that make it your default response, gradually diminishing your capacity for more effective approaches to these same challenges. Take a moment to imagine your life completely free from anger's influence. Picture your body relaxed, your mind clear, your relationships characterized by trust and open communication. Envision approaching challenges with creative flexibility rather than rigid reactivity. This isn't about becoming passive or accepting mistreatment. It's about responding to life's challenges from a place of centered clarity rather than emotional volatility. The true cost of chronic anger isn't just in its immediate effects, but in the life experiences it prevents. The moments of joy you can't fully appreciate, the connections you never develop, the opportunities you can't recognize through anger's distorting lens. These hidden costs accumulate over time, shaping not just your experience of the present moment but the very trajectory of your life. While you focus on defending your position or proving yourself right, countless precious moments slip away unnoticed. That promotion at work, that deepening friendship, that chance to truly connect with your child, all become casualties of anger's consuming presence. Your anger acts like a filter, transforming potentially enriching experiences into threats or affronts, leaving you perpetually poised for battle rather than open to life's possibilities. Each time you choose anger's familiar path, you unconsciously reinforce a way of moving through the world that dims your perception of beauty, dampens your capacity for joy, and distances you from the very connections your heart most deeply desires. Chapter 7. The Open Hand. Imagine holding a handful of sand. When you squeeze it tightly, desperately trying to keep every grain in your grasp, the sand inevitably escapes through your fingers. But when you open your palm and hold it gently, the sand rests peacefully, staying exactly where it is. This simple truth reflects the paradoxical nature of our relationship with anger. You've likely tried various anger management techniques: counting to 10, deep breathing, positive self-talk. While these approaches can provide temporary relief, they often strengthen anger's hold by reinforcing the idea that anger is something you must control. The harder you try to manage it, the more it seems to control you. The fundamental principle of letting go offers a radically different approach. Freedom from anger comes not from doing something to it, but from ceasing to do the things that sustain it. This distinction is crucial. When anger arises, you typically respond in one of two ways: suppression or expression. Suppression pushes anger down, creating internal pressure that eventually demands release. Expression vents anger outward, providing momentary relief, but often creating new problems and reinforcing anger as a go-to response. Both approaches maintain anger's power because they emerge from the same underlying premise, that anger is something you must do something with. But there's a third way: release. Release differs fundamentally from both suppression and expression. It involves opening around anger rather than either fighting or feeding it. Modern psychology aligns with ancient wisdom traditions in recognizing that our usual responses to anger involve various forms of mental, emotional, and physical gripping. This tension manifests as tightness in your body, rigid thinking patterns, and emotional resistance. Letting go begins with recognizing these patterns of tension and allowing them to soften. The process involves a profound paradox. Letting go requires both intention and non-effort. It's a deliberate choice to stop struggling, to cease the internal war with your experience. This isn't passive resignation, but an active surrender of the struggle that perpetuates anger's cycle. Experience this directly. Notice any tension in your body right now. First, try to force yourself to relax. Feel how this creates subtle resistance, a kind of pushing against your experience. Now, simply allow the tension to be there, giving it permission to release in its own time. Notice the difference between these approaches. The first creates more subtle tension. The second allows natural relaxation to occur. You might resist this approach, fearing that letting go means becoming passive or vulnerable. This concern is natural but misplaced. True letting go doesn't leave you defenseless, quite the opposite. By releasing the internal struggle with anger, you free up enormous energy and attention. This creates space for more effective responses to challenging situations. The gripping patterns that sustain anger often operate automatically, below conscious awareness. They might manifest as muscle tension, held breath, fixated thoughts, or emotional constriction. These patterns form a kind of internal architecture that keeps anger in place. Letting go begins with bringing gentle awareness to these patterns without trying to change them. When you stop doing the things that maintain anger, the mental rehearsal of grievances, the physical bracing, the emotional resistance, you may find that anger naturally begins to dissolve. This isn't because you've conquered it or achieved some special state. Rather, you've simply stopped feeding the processes that keep it alive. The open hand becomes both a physical gesture and a metaphor for this new relationship with anger. Instead of meeting anger with clenched fists of resistance or control, you learn to hold it with an open palm, neither pushing it away nor grasping at it. This fundamental shift in approach transforms your entire experience of anger. You begin to notice how different your body feels when you consciously unclench, shoulders dropping, breath deepening, jaw relaxing. The open hand represents a willingness to be present with what is, without the exhausting effort of fighting against reality. When anger arrives, you no longer treat it as an enemy to be vanquished or a problem to be solved. You simply acknowledge its presence, allow it to deliver its message, and watch as it naturally moves through you rather than becoming stuck. This isn't passive resignation, it's active, conscious allowing that paradoxically gives you more genuine power than all your previous attempts at control ever did. Chapter 8: The Space Between. Between every trigger and reaction lies a space, small at first, perhaps just the width of a single breath. But within it exists the seed of your freedom, like a martial artist who finds their greatest power not in the strike, but in the balanced pause before movement. Your ability to create space between stimulus and response holds the key to transforming your relationship with anger. You've likely experienced anger as an automatic response, feeling as though the emotion hijacks your system before you have any say in the matter. That car cuts you off in traffic, and instantly your heart races, hands clench the wheel, thoughts spiral into narratives of injustice. The reaction feels inevitable, as though there's no choice in how you respond. But here's what actually happens. Every external trigger passes through your nervous system before becoming a reaction. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, processes potential dangers in milliseconds, preparing your body for fight or flight. Without awareness, this biological response can bypass your prefrontal cortex, the center of higher reasoning and choice. The result feels like an automatic reaction, but it's really the collapse of space between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl, after surviving the concentration camps of World War II, came to a profound realization that speaks directly to this experience. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This insight, born from witnessing humanity in its darkest hours, reveals that even in the most challenging circumstances, this space exists. Your body actually sends early warning signals before anger fully manifests. Subtle tensions, changes in breathing, warming sensations. These physical cues provide an opportunity to recognize rising anger before it overwhelms. The key is learning to detect these signals and use them as reminders to pause. When you're cut off in traffic, there's a fraction of a second between seeing the other car and your reaction. When you receive a disrespectful email, there's a moment between reading the words and feeling the surge of anger. When someone speaks to you dismissively, there's a space between hearing their tone and your response. These moments, these choice points, contain the potential for different outcomes. The neuroscience supports this understanding. While the amygdala responds rapidly to perceived threats, the prefrontal cortex requires slightly more time to engage. By intentionally creating space through pausing, you allow your higher brain functions to come online, accessing your capacity for reasoned response rather than pure reaction. You might resist this idea, thinking it impossible to pause when anger strikes quickly and intensely. This is natural. The pause can feel vulnerable, like letting your guard down. But creating this space doesn't mean becoming passive or denying your experience. Instead, it means developing the capacity to hold your experience with awareness before acting from it. The practice begins simply. When you notice anger's early signals, take one conscious breath. This isn't about calming down or changing your state. It's about creating the minimal space needed for choice to enter the equation. This single breath becomes your anchor to the present moment, interrupting the automatic chain of reaction. With practice, you'll start noticing more choice points throughout your day, those brief moments where you can insert space before reacting. Each time you catch yourself and take that conscious breath, you strengthen your capacity to access this space. It's like building a muscle, gradually developing strength through consistent small efforts. This skill compounds over time. You might begin by catching yourself once or twice a day, perhaps only after you've already started to react. That's perfectly normal. Soon you'll recognize the signals earlier. A tightening in your chest, a flush of heat in your face, a sudden narrowing of your thoughts. These physical messengers arrive before your mind constructs its story of offense or injustice. The beauty of this approach is its simplicity. You don't need special techniques or perfect circumstances, just your awareness and that single breath. Even in your busiest moments, most heated arguments, or deepest frustrations, this tiny space remains available to you. And within that space lives your freedom to choose a response aligned with who you truly want to be, rather than being hijacked by the automatic reactions of your past conditioning. The space you create through pausing becomes a sanctuary of freedom. Within it, you find the power to choose responses aligned with your values rather than your conditioning. This isn't about controlling anger, but about creating conditions where wisdom can emerge naturally. That single conscious breath opens a doorway to possibilities that remain invisible when you're caught in reaction. In this sanctuary, you're no longer at the mercy of old patterns or automatic responses. You stand at a crossroads where multiple paths appear before you, not just the well-worn trail of habitual reaction. The beauty of this space is that it doesn't require elaborate techniques or perfect circumstances. It exists at any moment you choose to claim it, waiting to reveal options you couldn't see before. Chapter 9. The Witness Perspective. Picture yourself in the midst of a powerful storm. When you're caught in it, the wind and rain consume your entire experience. Your vision is limited to what's directly in front of you, and the intensity of the elements makes it impossible to think clearly or move with purpose. This is what it's like to be fully identified with anger, consumed by its force, limited in perspective and reactive rather than responsive. Now imagine viewing that same storm from a mountaintop shelter. You can see its full scope, where it begins and ends, how it moves across the landscape. While you still experience the storm's presence, you're no longer at its mercy. You have context, perspective, and the ability to respond with wisdom rather than reaction. This is what becomes possible when you develop the capacity to witness your anger rather than being consumed by it. You're likely familiar with being overtaken by anger, those moments when the emotion seems to hijack your entire being. Your heart races, your muscles tense, your thoughts narrow to a laser focus on whatever has triggered you. In these moments, you don't have anger. You are anger. Every cell in your body seems to vibrate with its energy, and it feels impossible to imagine any other way of being. But there's a profound truth about consciousness that can transform your relationship with anger. You are not your thoughts, emotions, or bodily sensations. You are the awareness in which these experiences arise. Just as a movie screen remains unchanged by the images projected upon it, your fundamental awareness remains untouched by the emotions passing through it. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's a practical reality you can verify through your own experience. Right now, you're aware of reading these words. You're aware of any emotions present in your body. You're aware of thoughts moving through your mind. This awareness itself, this knowing presence, is what you fundamentally are. Everything else, including anger, is something you experience rather than something you are. When anger arises, it appears in this space of awareness, like a storm appearing in the sky. The sky doesn't become the storm. It provides the space in which the storm can exist. Similarly, your awareness doesn't become anger. It provides the space in which anger can be fully experienced without consuming you. Just as clouds, no matter how dark and turbulent, pass through the vast expanse of sky without altering its essential nature, your anger moves through the field of your awareness without changing what you fundamentally are. Even in your most intense moments of rage, there remains this boundless space of consciousness that holds the experience while remaining untouched by it. This truth offers profound freedom. You're no longer at the mercy of anger because you recognize yourself as the unchanging awareness in which anger temporarily appears. This capacity to witness your experience rather than being completely identified with it is already present within you. Every time you've noticed yourself being angry, rather than just being lost in anger, you've touched this witnessing awareness. The key is developing this natural capacity, so it becomes more readily available, especially in challenging moments. Your brain's architecture supports this shift in perspective. While the limbic system generates emotional responses, the prefrontal cortex enables meta-awareness, the ability to observe your own mental and emotional processes. By intentionally engaging this capacity for self-reflection, you strengthen neural networks that support witnessed experience rather than pure reactivity. You might resist this approach, fearing that stepping back from anger means disconnecting from your authentic experience or becoming emotionally numb. But true witnessing actually allows for deeper engagement with emotions, because you can fully feel them without being overwhelmed by them. When you're no longer identified with anger as me or mine, you can explore it with genuine curiosity rather than resistance or attachment. The witnessing perspective reveals anger's impermanent nature. Like all emotional states, anger naturally arises and passes away when we don't grasp at it or push it away. From the witness perspective, you can observe this process directly, how anger emerges, intensifies, and eventually dissolves, all within the unchanging space of awareness. The key is learning to recognize anger as a temporary experience rather than a core identity. Instead of saying, "I am angry," which creates complete identification with the emotion, You can notice anger is present, or I'm experiencing anger. This subtle shift in language reflects and reinforces a profound shift in perspective, from being anger to having awareness of anger. As you develop this witnessing capacity, you'll discover that awareness itself is inherently peaceful. Even when strong emotions move through it, the observing presence remains undisturbed, like the deep ocean remaining calm despite surface waves. This doesn't mean you won't feel anger, but you'll experience it while remaining grounded in something more fundamental than any temporary emotional state. Chapter 10. The Inquiry Practice. When you examine the architecture of anger, you'll find that beneath every emotional reaction lies a foundation of thoughts and beliefs, interpretations you've accepted as reality without questioning their validity. These thoughts seem to arise spontaneously in response to triggers, feeling so true and solid that questioning them might appear pointless. Yet it's precisely these unexamined beliefs that keep anger's cycle spinning. Consider how your mind responds when someone cuts you off in traffic. In an instant, thoughts arise. They're completely inconsiderate. They did that on purpose. People have no respect anymore. These interpretations feel like direct perceptions of reality, rather than what they actually are. Stories your mind generates to make sense of a neutral event. The key to freedom lies not in changing these thoughts or replacing them with more positive ones, but in questioning their absolute truth. When you look closely at any anger-triggering thought, you'll discover that it contains elements of assumption, projection, and generalization that go far beyond the observable facts. This isn't about invalidating your perceptions or denying genuine infractions. Rather, it's about recognizing that between any event and your emotional response lies an interpretive layer that often goes unnoticed. By bringing awareness to this layer, you create space for new possibilities. A simple yet profound form of inquiry can illuminate the constructed nature of angry thoughts. Start by identifying a specific thought that fuels your anger and ask yourself, can I absolutely know this is true? This question isn't about whether something seems true or feels true, but whether you can know it with absolute certainty. For instance, when someone doesn't respond to your message, the thought, they're ignoring me, might arise. But can you absolutely know this? Could they be dealing with an emergency? Could they be overwhelmed with other responsibilities? Could they have simply not seen the message yet? The moment you find even one alternative possibility, the original thought loses its claim to absolute truth. The next question deepens the inquiry. What happens when I believe this thought? Notice how believing the thought affects your body, emotions, relationships, and actions. Does it create tension, anxiety, or defensiveness? Does it lead to reactive behavior that you later regret? This investigation reveals the real-world consequences of holding thoughts as unquestioned truth. Then ask yourself, who would I be without this thought? This isn't about suppressing or changing the thought, but simply imagining how you might experience the same situation if that particular interpretation didn't arise in your mind. Often you'll discover a natural clarity and peace that exists when you're not caught in reactive thinking. Finally, consider, what's another perspective that might be equally or more true? This opens your mind to alternative interpretations that might better serve you while still honoring the facts of the situation. The goal isn't to replace negative thoughts with positive ones, but to recognize that multiple perspectives can exist simultaneously. Through this systematic inquiry, you'll begin to notice patterns in your anger-triggering thoughts. Common themes might include assumptions about others' intentions, expectations about how things should be, or beliefs about what certain behaviors mean. As you question these patterns, their power to generate automatic anger begins to diminish. This process of inquiry becomes particularly powerful when applied to recurring triggers, those situations or relationships where anger seems to arise predictably. By examining the underlying thoughts driving these reactions, you often discover that what appeared as an external problem was actually maintained by internal beliefs. The practice isn't about reaching specific conclusions or adopting predetermined perspectives. Instead, it's about developing the capacity to hold your thoughts more lightly, recognizing them as interpretive lenses, rather than direct perceptions of reality. This shift alone often creates enough space for anger to naturally dissipate. Through consistent inquiry, you'll discover that freedom from anger doesn't require maintaining certain thoughts or achieving specific mental states. Rather, it emerges naturally from seeing through the solidity of the thoughts that normally fuel angry reactions. When thoughts are recognized as thoughts rather than truth, their power to generate automatic emotional reactions diminishes. This transformation happens not through force or control, but through clarity. As you practice questioning your anger-producing thoughts, you'll notice something remarkable. The space between an event and your reaction gradually widens. What once triggered an immediate flood of rage now creates a moment of awareness first. In this space lives your freedom, not because you've mastered techniques for suppressing emotion, but because you've developed the wisdom to recognize when your mind is creating stories that aren't serving you. The beauty of this approach is its simplicity. You don't need to become a different person or develop superhuman emotional control. You simply need to bring light to the unconscious thought processes that have been running on autopilot. When exposed to this light of awareness, many thoughts that seemed absolutely true and justified simply dissolve on their own. Chapter 11. The Compassion Bridge. Throughout my work with thousands of individuals struggling with anger, one truth consistently emerges. Beneath every expression of anger lies a deeper story of pain, fear, or unmet needs. Think of anger as a protective wall we build around our vulnerabilities. While it may seem to keep us safe, it also keeps us isolated and unable to truly connect with others or even parts of ourselves. When you experience anger, it creates an immediate separation, a gap between you and the person or situation triggering your response. This gap often feels necessary, as if maintaining that distance protects you from further hurt or violation. Yet this very separation perpetuates the cycle of anger and prevents the understanding that could lead to genuine resolution. Consider how anger functions in your closest relationships. When your partner forgets an important date, your child repeatedly ignores your requests, or a friend cancels plans at the last minute, anger arises as a natural response to feeling disregarded or disrespected. The mind quickly generates a story about their inconsideration or lack of care, and this narrative fuels defensive reactions that widen the emotional distance. But what happens when you pause to look beneath the surface of these triggering behaviors? Every action, no matter how frustrating, emerges from someone's attempt to meet their own needs or manage their own struggles. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior or negate the need for boundaries. Rather, it offers a perspective that can release you from the grip of reactive anger. Understanding this truth transforms how you relate to both others and yourself. When someone cuts you off in traffic, instead of assuming intentional disrespect, you might recognize they could be rushing to an emergency, distracted by personal crisis, or simply unaware of their impact. While their behavior may still require correction, your response can come from clarity rather than rage. This shift toward understanding becomes particularly powerful when applied to yourself. How often do you berate yourself for feeling angry, treating your own emotional responses as character flaws rather than natural human reactions? This self-judgment creates an internal war that only generates more anger. True freedom comes from extending the same understanding to yourself that you're learning to offer others. Research in neuroscience confirms that practicing compassion, both for others and ourselves, actually changes how our brains process anger triggers. When you regularly engage in perspective-taking and recognition of common humanity, the neural pathways associated with anger become less reactive, while those linked to emotional regulation strengthen. The practice of extending understanding begins with recognizing the universal human needs we all share. Whether expressed skillfully or destructively, all behavior stems from attempts to meet basic needs for safety, connection, respect, and meaning. This recognition doesn't require you to approve of harmful actions. It simply allows you to see the human being beneath the behavior. When you encounter someone whose actions trigger your anger, pause to consider, what might this person be struggling with? What fears or unmet needs could be driving their behavior? This isn't about making excuses, but about seeing the fuller picture that enables more effective responses. Similarly, when anger arises within you, practice turning toward it with curiosity rather than condemnation. What deeper message might this emotion be carrying? What values or needs feel threatened? This self-understanding creates space for responding rather than reacting. The real transformation occurs when you can hold both your own experience and others' humanity simultaneously. This balanced perspective allows you to maintain appropriate boundaries while releasing the extra suffering that comes from judgment and resentment. Remember that understanding doesn't mean absolving responsibility or accepting mistreatment. You can comprehend the factors influencing someone's behavior while still taking necessary steps to protect yourself or address the situation. Often coming from a place of understanding actually enables more effective action than reactions fueled by unexamined anger. Your capacity for understanding grows with practice. Start with smaller triggers and gradually extend to more challenging situations. Notice how this shift in perspective affects not just your anger, but your overall well-being and relationships. The ultimate paradox reveals itself. By understanding what drives others' difficult behaviors, you free yourself from the prison of reactive anger. In releasing the need to judge or condemn, you discover a natural peace that exists beneath the surface of emotional reactivity. This inner stillness has always been there, waiting patiently behind the noise of your interpretations and assumptions. When you look deeply into someone's actions without the fog of judgment clouding your vision, you begin to see the complex web of fears, wounds, and unmet needs that shape their behavior. This insight doesn't excuse their actions, but it liberates you from the exhausting cycle of resistance and reaction that keeps you bound to your own suffering. Chapter 12. The Freedom of Forgiveness. Through my years of studying human behavior and emotional patterns, I've observed how past hurts create present suffering, much like carrying stones in a backpack that grows heavier with each step. This weight isn't just metaphorical. Research shows that chronic resentment affects everything from heart health to immune function, essentially allowing past injuries to harm us long after the initial wound. You might believe you're protecting yourself by holding on to these grievances, keeping your guard up against future harm. Perhaps you feel that forgiveness means excusing inexcusable behavior or opening yourself to being hurt again. These concerns are valid and deserve acknowledgement. However, continuing to carry the weight of past injuries affects you far more than those who caused them. Consider the energy required to maintain resentment. Each time you replay a painful memory, your body responds as if the injury is happening again, flooding your system with stress hormones and maintaining a state of defensive tension. This biological response made sense when humans needed to remember and avoid genuine threats to survival. But in modern life, it often perpetuates unnecessary suffering. The path to freedom requires understanding what forgiveness truly is and isn't. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It doesn't require reconciliation with those who harmed you or putting yourself in position to be hurt again. True forgiveness is an internal process of releasing yourself from the burden of carrying old wounds into new moments. When you hold on to resentment about a coworker's betrayal from years ago, that resentment colors how you interact with current colleagues. When you can't release anger about a parent's failures, that anger often seeps into your own parenting. The past perpetuates itself through your grip on it. The weight of unforgiveness manifests in subtle ways: tension in your shoulders when certain names are mentioned, a knot in your stomach when you pass certain places, the mental energy spent rehearsing what you wish you'd said. These physical and psychological patterns keep you bound to old stories, preventing full engagement with present opportunities. Significant betrayals or deep wounds often require a process, rather than a single act of forgiveness. This process begins with acknowledging the full impact of what happened, not to reinforce the story, but to honor your experience. Just as physical wounds need cleaning before they can heal, emotional wounds need recognition before they can be released. The key insight is that forgiveness doesn't happen to make peace with the past. It happens to create peace in the present. Every moment spent reliving old hurts is a moment stolen from your current life. Every ounce of energy invested in maintaining resentment is energy unavailable for creating what you want now. Studies in neuroscience reveal that practicing forgiveness actually changes brain structure, reducing activity in areas associated with stress and strengthening regions linked to empathy and emotional regulation. This demonstrates that forgiveness is not just an emotional or philosophical choice. It's a physiological path to liberation. When you resist forgiveness, examine what that resistance protects. Often, holding on to anger feels like maintaining a form of justice or ensuring you never forget important lessons. But you can retain the wisdom gained from experience without carrying the emotional burden. Just as you can remember a broken bone without still feeling the pain, you can remember a betrayal without reliving the hurt. The process of releasing past hurts begins with a simple but profound shift, turning your focus from what others did to you toward what you continue doing to yourself by maintaining resentment. This shift transforms you from victim of past events to author of your present experience. Genuine forgiveness emerges not from moral obligation, but from the natural recognition that carrying these burdens no longer serves you. Just as you would eventually release your grip on a hot coal, regardless of who threw it at you, you can choose to release resentment because holding it hurts you most. This release often happens in layers. You might think you've forgiven something only to find another level of resentment beneath the surface. Each layer you release creates more space for presence and peace in your current life. The process itself becomes an act of reclaiming your power from past events. Remember that forgiveness doesn't require restoration of trust or resumption of a relationship. Some people will remain unsafe or inappropriate for close connection. Forgiveness is about your internal landscape rather than external relationships. You can release the emotional charge while maintaining wise boundaries. Chapter 13. The Wisdom of Boundaries. Picture a thriving garden protected by a well-designed fence that keeps out destructive forces while allowing in sunlight, rain, and beneficial insects. This fence doesn't isolate the garden. It creates the conditions for it to flourish. Your personal boundaries work in exactly the same way, yet many struggle with setting and maintaining them, fearing they'll appear selfish or damage their relationships. You've likely experienced how poor boundaries lead to resentment and anger. When you consistently override your own limits to please others, take on responsibilities that aren't yours, or allow people to treat you disrespectfully, you create perfect conditions for anger to flourish. This anger often emerges as a delayed response to numerous boundary violations, making it seem disproportionate to the triggering incident. Understanding boundaries requires recognizing three distinct patterns: rigid walls that isolate you from genuine connection, permeable boundaries that protect while allowing authentic relationships to flourish, and boundary violations that generate legitimate anger signals. These patterns manifest differently across various life domains, from intimate relationships to professional interactions to casual social encounters. In professional settings, poor boundaries might look like accepting additional work when you're already overwhelmed, failing to communicate your needs clearly, or allowing colleagues to interrupt your focus time. In personal relationships, boundary issues often appear as difficulties saying no, tolerating disrespectful behavior, or sacrificing your own well-being to maintain harmony. Boundary intelligence involves knowing when, how, and with whom to set different types of limits based on relationship context and personal needs. This discernment develops through paying attention to your internal signals, those subtle feelings of discomfort or resentment that indicate when your boundaries are being crossed. Imagine your personal space surrounded by a luminous, flexible boundary that you control. This boundary isn't rigid or impenetrable, it's responsive and intelligent. It can become firmer when you need protection, and more permeable when safety allows for greater intimacy. This living boundary responds to your needs while respecting others' autonomy. You might resist setting clear boundaries out of fear of rejection, conflict, or appearing difficult. Perhaps you've learned to associate boundaries with selfishness, or have seen relationships damaged by rigid limitations. However, clean, clear boundaries actually foster healthier relationships by preventing the accumulation of resentment that comes from chronic boundary violations. The areas where you experience recurring anger often point directly to boundary issues needing attention. When you find yourself repeatedly angry with certain people or in particular situations, it's usually a sign that you need to establish or reinforce appropriate limits. This pattern isn't random or meaningless. Your anger acts as an internal compass, highlighting exactly where your boundaries have become too porous or undefined. That familiar surge of frustration when someone interrupts your work, dismisses your feelings, or makes demands on your time without consideration. These are all signals that your personal limits are being crossed. Rather than seeing these moments purely as sources of distress, recognize them as valuable indicators guiding you toward necessary changes in how you protect your space and energy. Effective boundaries require both internal clarity and external communication. Internal clarity means knowing your limits, values, and non-negotiables. External communication involves expressing these limits clearly and directly without anger or apology. This might sound like, "I'm not available for extra projects right now," or "I need advance notice before social plans." By establishing appropriate boundaries, you create space for genuine peace rather than temporary harmony maintained through self-betrayal. These limits allow you to release the defensive anger that poor boundaries necessitate, transforming your relationships and your relationship with anger itself. The connection between boundaries and letting go becomes clear when you realize that proper limits eliminate the need for many anger responses. When you protect your space effectively, you no longer need anger as a defensive mechanism. This creates the foundation for true peace, not the peace of submission, but the peace of proper protection. Research in psychology consistently shows that individuals with well-defined boundaries experience less chronic anger and better relationship satisfaction. These findings confirm what you may intuitively sense, that creating appropriate space for yourself and others leads to more authentic connections and fewer triggers for anger. Remember that boundary setting is a skill developed through practice. Each time you honor your limits or communicate them clearly, you strengthen your boundary intelligence. This growing wisdom helps you navigate relationships with greater ease while reducing the conditions that typically generate anger. You wouldn't expect to master a musical instrument overnight, and the same patience applies to developing healthy boundaries. At first, you might feel uncomfortable or even guilty when protecting your space, but this discomfort fades as you witness the positive effects rippling through your life. Notice how relationships transform when you no longer rely on anger as your primary protector. Conversations become more authentic, connections deepen, and the exhausting cycle of resentment begins to dissolve. Your growing boundary intelligence becomes a quiet strength that others naturally respect, often without you having to say a word. Chapter 14: The Alchemy of Acceptance. In the constant flow of life, resistance often feels like our natural response to unwanted circumstances. Just as a boulder in a river creates turbulence by opposing the water's flow, our resistance to life's challenges generates internal turbulence we experience as anger. Yet the river holds profound wisdom. It doesn't fight the boulder, but flows around it, maintaining its essential nature while finding the path of least resistance. Your habit of resisting what is makes perfect sense. When faced with situations that feel wrong, unfair, or threatening, pushing back seems like the only logical response. Traffic jams warrant frustration. Critical feedback deserves defensive anger. Others' irritating behaviors justify your irritation. This pattern of resistance appears so natural that questioning it might seem absurd. Yet here lies a transformative truth. Your suffering arises not from the situations themselves, but from your resistance to them. This isn't about passively accepting mistreatment or abandoning your values. Rather, it's about recognizing that fighting against reality creates a second layer of pain, on top of whatever difficulty you're facing. Consider how differently you experience a traffic delay when you resist it versus when you accept its reality. In resistance, you tense your body, replay frustrated thoughts, and generate anger that changes nothing about the situation while deteriorating your well-being. In acceptance, you acknowledge the unchangeable reality of the delay, which frees your energy to make constructive choices. Whether that's calling ahead to adjust plans, using the time productively, or simply maintaining your peace. This distinction between passive resignation and active acceptance proves crucial. Resignation collapses into helplessness, while acceptance creates space for clear seeing and wise action. When you receive critical feedback, resignation says, "I'm worthless," while acceptance says, "This feedback exists. Now what can I learn from it?" When someone's behavior triggers you, resignation says, "I have to put up with this," while acceptance says, "This is happening." What boundaries do I need to set? The paradox becomes clear. Accepting what is actually creates the foundation for effective change. You can only transform what you first acknowledge. Fighting reality distorts your perception and scatters your energy, while acceptance focuses your power where it can make a difference. Research in stress physiology demonstrates how acceptance impacts our nervous system. When we resist reality, we maintain a state of fight-or-flight arousal that impairs cognitive function and escalates emotional reactivity. Acceptance, in contrast, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, creating the physiological conditions for clear thinking and considered response. Actual studies of mindfulness-based interventions show that increasing acceptance correlates with reduced anger, reactivity, and improved emotional regulation. This evidence supports what contemplative traditions have long taught, that meeting reality with acceptance rather than resistance creates the conditions for genuine peace. Your resistance often masquerades as strength, a way of standing up for yourself or fighting injustice. However, true power lies in clearly seeing what is while maintaining your center. Like the river, you can acknowledge obstacles without letting them diminish your essential nature or deflect you from your course. When you stop battling against reality, you discover an untapped reservoir of energy that was previously consumed by struggle. This shift transforms your relationship with challenging situations. Rather than exhausting yourself by fighting what cannot be changed, you harness your power to navigate life's inevitable obstacles with grace and wisdom. In this space of acceptance, you access a deeper strength, one that flows not from resistance, but from the profound understanding that you remain whole regardless of external circumstances. When triggered by others' behavior, notice how resistance creates an adversarial relationship that increases tension and reduces your effectiveness. Acceptance doesn't mean approving of their actions, but acknowledging their reality, which paradoxically frees you to respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. The practice becomes simple but profound. In any triggering situation, first say yes to its reality. This doesn't mean you like it or want it to continue. It means you stop fighting the fact that it exists. From this ground of acceptance, you can then discern what aspects you can influence and what aspects require letting go. This transformation of resistance into acceptance creates an alchemical shift in your relationship with anger. Rather than generating fresh fuel for your anger through constant opposition to reality, you develop the capacity to flow with life while maintaining your integrity. This creates space for genuine peace, not the false peace of suppression or resignation, but the authentic peace of clear seeing and wise response. As you embrace what is, your energy shifts from fighting shadows to illuminating possibilities. You'll find yourself responding to provocations with a steadiness that might have seemed impossible before. Not because you've become passive, but because you've accessed a deeper wisdom that transcends the need for defensive reactions. This is the paradoxical power of acceptance. In surrendering the battle against reality, you gain the clarity to transform it. Chapter 15. The Power of Perspective. When you're caught in anger's grip, your vision narrows like a camera lens zooming in on a single point, excluding everything else from view. This tunnel vision makes the triggering event seem like the entire world, as though nothing else exists beyond this moment of frustration, this slight, this obstacle. You lose sight of the broader context, the flow of time, and the myriad perspectives that might offer relief from anger's intensity. Imagine viewing your life through different lenses, some that magnify problems until they overwhelm your field of vision, others that reveal the vast landscape of context surrounding any given moment. The same situation can feel radically different depending on which lens you're looking through. A criticism that feels devastating through the magnifying glass of anger might appear as valuable feedback when viewed through a lens of growth. A frustrating setback that seems catastrophic in the moment might register as a minor bump when seen through the telescope of time. This powerful shift in perspective doesn't deny or diminish your initial emotional response. Rather, it expands your view to include more of reality, creating space around the intense feelings that can otherwise consume you. When you zoom out from the close-up shot of anger, you gain access to wisdom that the narrow view obscures. Three natural dimensions of perspective offer immediate relief from anger's tunnel vision. The temporal dimension asks how this situation might look in a week, a month, or a year from now. The personal dimension considers how others involved might be viewing the same circumstances. The contextual dimension examines what larger factors might be influencing the situation beyond what's immediately visible. Brain imaging studies reveal that engaging in perspective-taking activities literally calms the amygdala, your brain's alarm center, while activating regions associated with executive function and emotional regulation. This biological shift creates the neural conditions for responding with wisdom rather than reactivity. Consider how these perspective shifts transform common trigger situations. When a colleague criticizes your work, the narrow view fixates on the perceived attack, generating defensive anger. The temporal perspective reminds you how previous criticisms that initially stung later proved valuable for your growth. The personal perspective considers what pressures or expectations might be driving your colleague's communication style. The contextual view examines how organizational culture, project deadlines, or other factors might be influencing the interaction. In relationship conflicts, the narrow view gets trapped in who's right and who's wrong. The temporal perspective considers the relationship's broader arc and what will matter in the long run. The personal perspective explores what fears or unmet needs might be driving your partner's behavior. The contextual view examines how external stressors, past experiences, or cultural differences might be shaping the dynamic. When facing frustrating setbacks, the narrow view sees only the immediate obstacle. The temporal perspective recalls how previous setbacks often led to unexpected opportunities. The personal perspective considers how others have navigated similar challenges. The contextual view examines how this setback fits into your larger life journey. This capacity for broader perspective becomes particularly powerful during heated moments. Simply asking yourself, "How will I view this situation a month from now?" can create enough mental space to interrupt the automatic anger response. Wondering, "What might I be missing about their perspective?" opens the door to empathy that anger typically blocks. None of this means ignoring or minimizing genuinely problematic situations. The goal isn't to explain away legitimate concerns, but to view them with clarity that anger's tunnel vision prevents. Often, seeing more clearly reveals more effective responses than anger would suggest. When you're stuck in traffic, the narrow view generates futile rage at the delay. The temporal perspective remembers that every previous traffic jam eventually ended. The personal perspective considers how other drivers might be feeling equally frustrated. The contextual view examines how this moment fits into the larger pattern of your day. This practice of expanding perspective becomes a reliable tool for transforming anger in the moment. As you develop this skill, you'll find yourself naturally shifting to broader views when triggers arise, creating space for choice where previously there seemed only automatic reaction. Perspective shifts serve as reliable pathways out of anger's tunnel, revealing the broader landscape of possibility that anger obscures. What looks different truly feels different, not because you're denying reality, but because you're seeing more of it. Chapter 16. The Gratitude Shift. When you walk through an urban landscape, your attention naturally gravitates toward the concrete, steel, and glass that dominate the environment. Yet sometimes, breaking through a crack in the sidewalk, you might notice a small flower, resilient, vibrant, and alive despite its harsh surroundings. This simple sight offers a profound truth about the nature of appreciation. Even in the most challenging circumstances, something of value exists, if you're willing to look for it. You might be skeptical about the role of gratitude in managing anger. After all, when someone cuts you off in traffic, criticizes your work unfairly, or dismisses your feelings, appreciation isn't your natural response. Your mind immediately focuses on the threat, the disrespect, or the injury. And this narrow focus feeds the flames of anger. This reaction isn't wrong. It's how your brain is wired to protect you. But this default setting, while natural, often traps you in patterns of reactivity that perpetuate suffering. Research in neuroscience and psychology reveals something remarkable. Your brain cannot simultaneously process feelings of genuine gratitude and anger. They operate on different neural circuits, and when you activate one, you naturally diminish the other. This isn't about forcing positive thinking or denying legitimate problems. Rather, it's about expanding your awareness to include aspects of your experience that anger typically obscures. Consider how this works in practice. When stuck in traffic, your immediate focus goes to the delay, the inconvenience, and perhaps the inconsiderate drivers around you. These thoughts naturally generate anger. But in that same moment, you could acknowledge the safety of your vehicle, the technology that lets you notify others of your delay, or even the unexpected time to listen to a favorite podcast. Neither perspective negates the other, but the second creates space around the anger rather than feeding it. Workplace conflicts offer another revealing example. When facing criticism or difficult colleagues, anger narrows your focus to the apparent attack or unfairness. Yet within that same situation might be opportunities for growth, chances to practice boundaries, or insights into your own triggers. Again, this isn't about pretending the challenge doesn't exist, but about recognizing that most situations contain both difficulty and value. Your capacity for gratitude functions like a muscle. It strengthens with consistent use and atrophies with neglect. Each time you intentionally look for something to appreciate in a triggering situation, you build this capacity. Over time, this practice rewires your neural pathways, making appreciation more accessible even in challenging moments. Think back to a past difficulty that initially seemed purely negative, but ultimately led to growth, learning, or unexpected benefits. Perhaps a job loss that forced you to pursue a more fulfilling path, or a relationship ending that taught you crucial lessons about yourself. This reflection isn't about minimizing past pain, but about recognizing how time often reveals value hidden within challenges. You might resist this approach when facing situations that seem to contain nothing worthy of appreciation. Some experiences appear purely negative, and trying to find gratitude feels impossible or even inappropriate. But appreciation doesn't require denying difficulty. It simply involves broadening your focus beyond the challenging aspects that anger automatically highlights. Health psychology research demonstrates that cultivating gratitude reduces stress hormones, lowers blood pressure, and improves immune function. These physiological changes create better conditions for responding to triggers with wisdom rather than reactivity. The practice literally changes your body's biochemistry, making it easier to access clear thinking in challenging moments. When you encounter triggering situations, a simple three-step practice can help you access appreciation without denying difficulty. First, acknowledge the challenge honestly, naming what's hard or painful about the situation. Second, intentionally identify one aspect you can appreciate no matter how small. Third, notice how this broader perspective affects your emotional state. This isn't about manufacturing positive feelings, but about creating space around the anger. This practice requires consistency and patience. Like any skill, it develops through regular exercise rather than occasional effort. Each time you find something to appreciate in a difficult moment, you strengthen your capacity to hold both challenge and value simultaneously. This expanded awareness naturally loosens anger's grip without requiring you to suppress or deny your initial reactions. Chapter 17. The Responsibility. When you stand at a crossroads, multiple paths stretch before you, each leading to different destinations. This same moment of choice exists whenever anger arises, though it rarely feels that way in the heat of the moment. Your reactions might feel automatic, as though anger instantly transforms thought into action, leaving no space for conscious choice. Yet within that narrow gap between trigger and response lies your greatest freedom. Consider how often you've looked back on an angry outburst and wished you'd responded differently. In those moments of reflection, alternative responses become clear. You could have taken a breath, asked a clarifying question, or simply walked away. This hindsight reveals an essential truth. Different responses were always possible, even if they weren't accessible in the moment. Viktor Frankl, having endured the unimaginable horrors of concentration camps, discovered that even in the most extreme circumstances, humans retain one fundamental freedom: the ability to choose their attitude toward any situation. This profound insight reveals that while you cannot always control what happens to you, you maintain control over how you respond. The distinction between reaction and response proves crucial here. Reactions emerge automatically from habit and conditioning. They're the patterns you've developed over years of handling difficult situations. Responses, in contrast, arise from conscious awareness and deliberate choice. This difference might seem subtle, but it represents the boundary between being controlled by anger and maintaining sovereignty over your actions. When a colleague criticizes your work, the automatic reaction might be defensive anger, perhaps snapping back or withdrawing in hostile silence. But in that same moment, multiple alternative responses exist. You could get curious about their perspective, calmly assert your boundaries, or take time to process before engaging. Each option creates different consequences, yet accessing these choices requires developing what psychologists call response flexibility. Response flexibility represents your capacity to pause, consider options, and consciously select your behavior rather than defaulting to habit. Like any skill, it strengthens through practice. The more you exercise this ability in low-stakes situations, the more accessible it becomes during intense triggers. Workplace dynamics often provide clear examples of how different responses create different outcomes. When faced with a frustrating email, you might habitually fire back an angry response. But pausing to consider alternatives could lead to scheduling a constructive conversation, seeking clarification, or addressing the underlying issue rather than reacting to the surface trigger. You might resist this idea, knowing how overwhelming strong emotions can feel. Some reactions seem too powerful to override, as though anger floods your system too quickly for conscious choice. This experience is valid, yet it represents your current capacity rather than your ultimate potential. Responsibility develops gradually, beginning with small triggers and expanding to more challenging situations. The key lies in recognizing that every triggering moment contains a choice point, a tiny gap between stimulus and response where awareness can enter. This gap might initially feel microscopic, but it expands through consistent practice. Each time you catch yourself before reacting, you strengthen your ability to access this space of choice. Research in neuroplasticity shows that this capacity for conscious response literally rewires your brain over time. Each deliberate choice reinforces neural pathways that support response flexibility, making it progressively easier to access alternatives in triggering moments. Your habitual reactions developed for valid reasons. They served as protection, helped establish boundaries, or expressed important needs. Acknowledging their past utility creates self-compassion, while recognizing that you can now develop more effective responses. This isn't about judging your reactions, but about expanding your behavioral repertoire. Development of response flexibility begins with awareness of your typical reaction patterns. Notice what types of situations consistently trigger automatic responses. Observe the physical sensations, thoughts, and emotions that arise. This awareness itself creates space for choice, even before considering alternative responses. The pause practice offers a simple but powerful tool for accessing the choice point in daily life. When you notice a trigger arising, intentionally pause. Take one conscious breath. This brief moment interrupts the automatic reaction sequence and creates space for conscious choice. Even if you ultimately choose the same response, it becomes a choice rather than an inevitability. True freedom emerges not from controlling external circumstances, but from choosing your way of being with them. This represents the essence of letting go, releasing the illusion that you must react in particular ways while embracing your power to choose conscious responses. Chapter 18. The Integrated Life. Just as a master musician no longer thinks about individual notes, but simply flows with the music, your journey with anger can evolve from conscious technique to natural peace. Through dedicated practice, what begins as deliberate effort transforms into effortless wisdom, not through force or control, but through deep integration of understanding. Throughout this book, you've explored various aspects of anger and learned powerful tools for working with it. You've discovered how to pause, question your thoughts, shift perspective, and choose conscious responses. Yet you might wonder, will I always need to consciously apply these practices? Will peace ever feel natural rather than achieved? The transition from doing practices to being at peace mirrors how we learn any complex skill. Consider how you learn to drive a car. Initially, every action required intense concentration, checking mirrors, signaling turns, maintaining proper speed, and staying in your lane. Yet now you likely navigate complex traffic situations while holding conversations or thinking about other matters. The individual components have integrated into fluid competence. This same progression occurs as you develop a new relationship with anger. What begins as conscious application of techniques gradually becomes integrated understanding that shapes your perceptions and responses before thought intervenes. This represents the difference between doing peaceful practices and being peace itself. Neuroscience confirms this progression from conscious effort to embodied wisdom. When learning any new skill, the brain initially requires high activation in areas associated with conscious control. As mastery develops, these same actions become encoded in deeper brain regions that operate below conscious awareness. Your responses become both more effective and more effortless. This integration manifests in subtle but significant ways. Perhaps you've already noticed moments where you responded to a trigger with unexpected calm. Not because you remembered to apply a technique, but because something has shifted in your basic relationship with anger. These spontaneous moments of peace reveal the natural wisdom that emerges through consistent practice. The development of embodied wisdom doesn't mean you'll never experience anger again. Rather, it manifests as a growing capacity to hold emotional experiences with greater spaciousness and return to equilibrium more quickly when triggered. Like a martial artist who maintains balance even when pushed, you develop the ability to stay centered amidst life's challenges. You might resist this possibility, doubting whether such deep transformation is truly possible. Perhaps you've struggled with anger for so long that it feels fundamentally woven into your identity. Yet small shifts are already occurring, moments when you naturally choose peace without conscious effort. These glimpses reveal your growing capacity for living from integrated understanding. This evolution requires acknowledging and celebrating these subtle signs of transformation. Each time you notice yourself responding differently without trying, you reinforce new neural pathways. Rather than focusing on how far you still have to go, recognize how far you've already come. Every natural moment of peace builds momentum toward embodied wisdom. The process unfolds gradually, like water slowly wearing away stone. You don't need to force or rush it. Simply maintain consistent practice while remaining open to evidence of integration. Notice when peace arises spontaneously. Observe how triggers that once provoked automatic reactions now create space for choice. Recognition itself accelerates transformation. Integration doesn't mean achieving some perfect state of perpetual calm. It means developing trust in your fundamental capacity for peace, even amid life's inevitable challenges. Like the musician who can return to the melody even after a missed note, you cultivate the ability to reconnect with peace when temporarily knocked off center. This represents the deepest form of letting go, releasing not just individual instances of anger, but the very concept of yourself as someone prone to anger. You open to a larger identity as awareness itself, naturally capable of holding all experiences with increasing equanimity. From this space, peace becomes not something you do, but simply what you are. Your fundamental nature emerges as spacious and unbound, free from the old stories of reactivity and struggle. Like a vast sky that remains unchanged regardless of the weather passing through it, you discover an innate capacity to embrace all of life's moments without being defined by them. This isn't about becoming a different person. It's about recognizing who you've always been beneath the layers of accumulated tension and defensive patterns. Conclusion. As you reach the end of this journey, pause for a moment and notice how your hands feel. Remember the heavy stones you were carrying when we began, the grievances, resentments, and anger that seemed so essential to hold on to. Notice how your grip has gradually loosened, how your shoulders have begun to relax, how your breath moves more freely. This lightness isn't because the challenges in your life have disappeared, but because you've discovered the profound truth that peace comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from releasing your internal holds. Throughout these pages, you've explored how anger persists, not through the power of triggers, but through your own patterns of holding, the rigid expectations that create constant disappointment, the blame narratives that keep wounds fresh, and the illusion of control that generates endless frustration. You've seen how these patterns, though once protective, have become the very chains that bind you to suffering. This journey from anger to peace isn't about reaching some perfect state of perpetual calm. It's about walking a path with increasing awareness and skill, understanding that each step brings you closer to your natural state of equilibrium. You'll still experience anger. This is part of being human, a natural response to life's challenges. But now you possess something invaluable, the understanding that anger need not hijack your life or define your experience. As you implement these insights in daily life, you'll encounter challenges. There will be days when old patterns resurface strongly, when you react before remembering to pause, when the practice feels harder than it should. Know that these moments aren't failures. They're opportunities for deeper learning, chances to practice self-compassion and strengthen your commitment to peace. Progress, not perfection, is the goal. What's emerging through this work goes beyond anger management techniques. As you release the habitual tensions and defensive patterns, you naturally create space for deeper qualities to emerge. Compassion for yourself and others, wisdom in challenging situations, and an abiding sense of inner peace that comes from knowing you're no longer at war with life itself. The practices you've learned, creating space between trigger and response, questioning thoughts that fuel anger, shifting to broader perspectives, and choosing conscious responses, aren't separate techniques to remember and apply. They're aspects of a unified approach to living, different facets of the same jewel of awareness. With consistent practice, these once conscious efforts become integrated into who you are, requiring less deliberate application over time. Each moment offers a fresh opportunity to choose peace over anger. This choice becomes increasingly natural, not because anger disappears from your life, but because your relationship with it has fundamentally transformed. You no longer see it as an enemy to battle, but as a messenger to hear and release. The power that once seemed to reside in external triggers returns to where it always belonged, in your own hands, in your capacity to respond rather than react. You carry within you an innate capacity for peace that no external circumstance can disturb. This truth has always been present, though perhaps hidden beneath layers of protective patterns and habitual reactions. As you continue this journey, remember that you're not becoming something different. You're allowing your natural wisdom and equilibrium to emerge more fully. The path ahead remains yours to walk, but you no longer walk it alone. You carry with you the insights and understanding that can transform any moment of anger into an opportunity for deeper peace. Trust in this process. Trust in your capacity to change, and most importantly, trust in the peace that is your natural state. Let your hands open fully now, releasing the last traces of those heavy stones you once carried. Feel the freedom that comes with empty hands, not empty of purpose or power, but empty of the burdens that kept you bound to suffering. This is your birthright, to live in peace, to respond with wisdom, and to meet each moment with an open heart and steady presence.